Yeah.
And so that we were going to talk about it when she gets back.
Yeah, she'll be back.
We got 2 new people again, so then it's a year, so we have to sell that. And then,
Yeah, we've got good move some chairs around.
I believe the parking is probably better.
Yeah, I've got a drawing in the garden area.
I really would like to put it back to make that like go off the railroad.
Here's my backyard engineer. Oh, it's 210 degrees right now. I'll tell you in a minute.
So we'll talk about it.
Thank you for the update.
Just like you, I mean,
Too fast for John's got an update. He is not having any another rule on the time a few weeks ago, and I gave him press for just a short period of time. And then right back.
Doctor here.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Scott.
Good morning. I'll have to go out there.
Yes, yeah.
Where are you going? You still listen here? You listen to your
I know you're up there. I know you're up there.
We had our
announcements for what we have going on. I mentioned last time that we are collecting gift cards for the Women of Redeeming Grace Ministries. We're trying to get some gift cards together to give to them at the end of this month, and so we need gift cards for like big box stores like Walmart, B Turners, Target, Kohl's, so they can get just basic supplies. So we've already got some coming in, which is really fantastic. I'm trying to think what else is going on in the life of our church. A lot of y'all knew Lucy Littleton very well and know Taylor, and her burial is today at 1:30. If you see people kind of coming in and coming out, that's what's going on. That's what's going on today. Let me, before we dig in, I don't know if y'all saw this, but on Sunday, Bishop John Shelby Spong died. And some of y'all may have read some of Bishop Spong's work. And Bishop Spong was a big name in the Episcopal Church. He was a cause celeb or a figure of controversy. You know, he was on every, whether you agreed with him or you couldn't stand it, he was always on everybody's tongue as far as the conversation point. Some of y'all may remember a Bishop Pike. Bishop Spong was kind of his generation's Bishop Pike. He was always constantly in conversation. I have a complicated history with Bishop Spong. Of course, I didn't know the man. But like I said, I said before, I grew up kind of one foot into the Episcopal Church, one foot out of the Episcopal Church. To the extent that we had a strong church connection, it was at Church Nativity in Huntsville. And I was raised more or less secular slash Episcopal, which is an oxymoron, or redundant, I should say. So the only theologian that I ever remember talking about growing up was Bishop Spong. Bishop Spong actually made it into my household, and I remember there's a book called My Jewish Lord, and another one that I can't remember. I read both of them in high school, it was the first time that kind of theology kind of moved into my life, which I'm really, really grateful for. I would later kind of reject Bishop Spong, right? So the people, there's a lot of people in my generation who kind of formed their theology. One generation is always rejecting the previous one, and so on and so forth, right? Like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, over and over and over again. And in my group of peers, a lot of us were really into this thing about open orthodoxy or generous orthodoxy, which is, you might argue, is a kind of form of postmodernism, where it's saying we've had enough of the deconstruction of the past. What are we going to construct? Right? We actually want to believe in something. We were raised in secularism, so we want to make a move toward Christian orthodoxy, not away from it. And in a lot of ways, Bishop Spong was kind of the whipping boy, or sort of straw man that we based a lot of our theological approaches against. I think somewhat unfairly, as I think about it. But then later on, I read this great thing. So Karl Barth, right, my theological hero, rejected the work of one of his predecessors, another German theologian named Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher's work was largely similar to Bishop Spong in some respects. It was sort of a modernist accommodation of Christianity. And Barth was a student of Schleiermacher's, but ended up rejecting Schleiermacher and forming his own theological tradition. But he would say in his classes, this great thing: before you criticize Schleiermacher, you must love Schleiermacher. Which I think is a beautiful way. I think is a beautiful way of thinking of it, right? Like in order to reject someone's theological work, you actually have to view it with a generous eye before rejecting it. And the person I'm studying with right now, Dr. Paul Hinlicky, he has a similar thing. It's called the Hinlicky Rule, which is that you can't disagree with a theologian or a thinker or another person until you can restate what they've said to their satisfaction. Right? Only when you've restated what they've said to their satisfaction can you then make a move of critique. Right? So if you're going to reject Schleiermacher, you need to state Schleiermacher in a way that he'd be banging his hand and be like, somebody gets me. Thankfully, somebody understands me. And so I've grown to a more charitable view, I hope, of Bishop Spong. Which is that it's very easy for people from my generation, people born in the 80s, to not appreciate the challenge of modernity, right? The challenge of modernity, which demanded that we change so much of our understanding of life that happened in the 20th century, right? I mean, if we think about that, right? Like my great-great-grandparents, their life was not that much different from their great-great-grandparents, right? I mean, there were a few kind of improvements, but largely their lives were more or less the same, right? But my grandparents were born in the 1920s, right, in rural Alabama, North Florida, rural Alabama. And you think of what that world was like, all the various aspects of that world. My granddad ends up working at Marshall Space Flight Center, literally taking pictures of people who are sending people to the moon, and then dies in the internet age, right? So you think about this pace of change that happened in what we call modernity. It was staggering pace change, and theologians like Bishop Spong thought that the church needed to be more aggressive in their response to that change. And that's not by definition a bad project. Actually, there are a lot of good things that are part of that project. As we now consider their legacy, they threw out some babies with the bathwater, which we're now trying to recover. But we really are. I think to some degree we are building upon them as we take a different approach, right? So Barth was building on Schleiermacher, even as he was rejecting Schleiermacher. And I think in a lot of ways, I am building on Spong and his cohorts while rejecting Spong, right? And what do I mean, right? So Bishop Spong in his writing rejects a lot of what he would describe as kind of the literal claims of Scripture, right? He said faith in Christ is not dependent on things like the virgin birth, the actual miracles, so on and so forth. I wouldn't quite agree with that, actually, right? I think you have to take the claims of the New Testament at face value. But his basic point, which is that the point of the Bible is to reveal Christ to us, and our faith is in Christ, not the Bible, is actually a part of how I understand my approach to Scripture kind of to begin with, right? So I want to share with you the passing of this person who devoted their life to the church, an appreciation, all the while we're giving a critique, and even if some would describe Bishop Spong, I think correctly in a lot of places as a heretic, we forget that actually heretics are how we got orthodoxy, right? Heretics are how we got the church, right? So, and there's a word for it, heresiarch. And a heresiarch is like Arius, right? The reason we have the canon of Scripture we have is from a person named Arius in the 3rd century, who said our Bible needs to be Luke's gospel and Paul's letters and nothing else. Chuck out the Old Testament. James is embarrassing. Matthew and Mark seem sort of archaic with all their demon talk. Luke and Paul, we're good to go, right? And it's in response to that the canon of the New Testament was put together in continuity with the Old Testament. And so the church depends on brave people saying from time to time, I don't buy this, in order for the church to discover what it actually does buy. Tradition needs to be tested. A tradition that can't be tested is not a tradition. It's brittle. It's not capacious. So all I have to say, you guys are I'm obviously working something out on y'all this morning. That's pretty clear. But I actually, for as much time as I spent, a sort of, gosh, it's a hard thing to say, a less mature version of myself, which I know pales in, can you only imagine? A less mature version of myself beat up on Bishop Spong a lot in my kind of thinking and conversation. But when I saw his death, I was really sad and wanted to reevaluate my viewpoint, my viewpoint on the man, and appreciate his life, appreciate his life and his legacy. But I'm going to say this, I went to this really cool church planting conference one time, and it was not Episcopal, it was largely kind of evangelical. It was at BC Seminary in Birmingham, like the coolest looking people you've ever seen. I mean, like the hair, the outfits, the sneakers, everybody was like, I was so lame. In this group, and like one of the main speakers was a guy, Matt Chandler. You may have heard of him. He's a big deal in that kind of non-phenomenal world. And this was like an auditorium full of like aspiring young church types, right? Up and coming, aspiring young church types. And one of the things he said is, guys, the first thing we established, we're pumped, we're excited. We feel like God has told us to go forth and build the future of the church. We're not going to do any of that properly by beating up on older faithful ministers of the gospel, right? That's not going to get us where we want to go. And that was a challenging word to give to that group. And I think he was on the same. He was probably about 10 years ago. He's probably in his late 30s, early 40s, kind of like where I am right now. That's something that sort of shows you the necessity of that. So, all right. Any thoughts or questions about Bishop Spong? Kind of where we're at that. I know a lot of y'all have read him. Read him as well. Yeah, Bill.
Thank you for saying all that. I really appreciate it.
Bishop Spong made me think.
Absolutely, yes. He absolutely did.
He wants to grow.
Yep. And I think what's cool about Bishop if you think about Bishop Spong grew up in fundamentalism, right? And so the arc of his career was kind of a rejection of fundamentalism. And I grew up in secularism, and have been rejecting secularism. So in a way, it's kind of a meeting. It's kind of a meeting, which is sort of my whole story, which is sort of my whole story of the church. Anyway, all right. Let's pray. I think we should pray, and I think we should thank the Lord for Bishop Spong and his life and witness. The Lord be with you. Lord, you have called us to this just wonderful, complicated, controversy-ridden life of the church. Lord, we're always agreeing and disagreeing, learning and unlearning, and there are people that that hold viewpoints which make our blood boil, and yet somehow we love. Lord, help us to know that our experience of you is not our capture of you, that our knowledge of you is not our possession of you, that you are leading in ways that we cannot know and that we don't control. Lord, thank you for all the faithful witnesses, pastors, bishops, priests, and teachers who have gone before, including Bishop Spong. I thank you for our sister Lucy and her life and witness that we honor today. Amen. All right, let us dig in. Finally, Jeff, get down to business. Can we study the Bible and stop having this to be a theological therapy session? Okay. All right, Mark chapter 1, verse 21. Mark chapter 1, verse 21. And they entered Capernaum, and on the Sabbath he went into the synagogue and immediately began to teach. And the people were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not in the way the scribes did. And immediately in their synagogue there was a man in an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, What do we have to do with you, Jesus the Nazarene? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, Shut up. Come out of him. And the unclean spirit came out of him after convulsing him and uttering a loud cry. And they were awestruck, so that they asked one another, saying, What is this? A new teaching with authority? He even gives orders to the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And immediately his fame spread everywhere into all the region of the Galilee. All right, can you imagine going to church that Sabbath, right? Like we would never forget. We would never forget that Sunday. Like we'd be talking about that for 50 years in the parish history of the church. A demon, the demons call out. I always so I am such an inveterate people pleaser, right? So I get someone criticizes something I do, and it's sort of less so. Thankfully, I'm getting the bigger skin as the years go on, but it's sort of wounded, and it cuts me to the quick. Literally, Jesus preaches, and the demons bark out. Right? Think of the great gulf between me as a preacher and Jesus as a preacher. Like little mild criticism cuts me to the heart, and literally the demons are coming out of people as Jesus preaches. So we should expect that, right? We should expect the demons to come out. It blows me away. Jesus as the preacher is underappreciated and undervalued. Remember when he goes to the different synagogue, this one in Nazareth in Luke's gospel, right? And he holds up the scroll of Isaiah and he says, This has been fulfilled in your hearing. And obviously they're not really into it. And he said, You know what? There was a Gentile, right, who was named Naaman, who lived in the time of Elijah, and he actually got what God was doing. And so there's other people who are not going to get what you're getting, or you're refusing to get. They're going to come and so they love that message so much they try to push him off a cliff. Because literally his sermon was met with they wanted to try to kill him right then there. And then again, that humbles me to think about the work of preaching. Anyway, so okay, a couple cool things here. The demons recognize Jesus. They recognize him spot off, right? Remember this past Sunday we're talking about Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. It takes 8 whole chapters for the disciples to say who Jesus is. The demons know it from word 1, right? The demons understand exactly who Jesus is. Now, why do they understand that? What Joel Marcus points out is that the demons recognize Jesus because they, like him, are spiritual beings. He's a spiritual being as well as a fleshly being, and they are spiritual beings, and they know each other. They recognize one another. It's sort of like it's not like football, but it's a good opportunity to tell a story. So I grew up in Huntsville. I played soccer. Playing soccer was very important to me. Our big rival was Randolph, which was a private school, and then Grissom High School, which was the other majority white high school. They had a very good soccer program. And you grow up playing against these guys all through. It's real bad blood, right, between Huntsville High and Grissom. And when I moved to Birmingham, we just got married, and we're making nice with a neighbor who lives right next door to us, and we're just chatting. And then somehow footy comes up. I'm like, "Oh, you're a footy fan?" Like, "Yeah, I love footy." I'm like, "Oh man, cool. Did you play?" Like, "Hey, I played in high school." "Oh, me too." "Where are you from?" "I'm from Huntsville." "No way." Like, "Who'd you play for?" He's like, "Grissom." There's a reptilian part of me that was like, roll a ball after somebody. It wasn't chosen. It was like elemental. It was reptilian. right? Just that nice guy out on the front lawn, like roll the ball out here. But I think that's what's going on. And remember too, we talk about this so much in this Bible study about how the kingdom of God or creation in the Jewish mind is one creation. It's not heaven and earth. It's not spirit and material. It's the same deal, right? We just don't perceive it. You and I don't see much of the spirit in our day-to-day life, but Jesus does, right? So you imagine like when Jesus goes into a synagogue, he's seeing more than we're seeing, right? He's seeing the demonic possession of people. And we think about that too. Like I see that at worship sometimes too, right? Like I have this beautiful vantage point of getting to see people as they come to communion. You know, very few people get to sort of see people as they come to communion. And what we bring into church is the history of all these difficult things that have held us down, right? Like you think about all the painful personal history that we bring to church, right? That would be kind of our psychological way of describing the demonic possession, I think, that Jesus sees. So when Jesus sees us, he sees our soul, he sees our whole biography, he sees the demons that possess us, which are there, they're here in this room right now, but we just don't pick up on that, right? Now, that's not sound like a bunch of woo-woo stuff. I don't mean it to be woo-woo stuff. What I'm saying is that like you have a spirit, I have a spirit, and that spirit is the non-physical part of me. It's my history, it's my personality, it's my fear, it's my worries. All those things constitute you and me. It'd be crazy to say that they don't. And we know that's true, right? Because you think about, right, like things like the spirit of the Marine Corps, right? The Marine Corps has a spirit. And you would never say the Marine Corps is the same as the Air Force. They have different non-tangible culture. Well, we're more comfortable with culture. But we're saying the same thing, right? The culture of a community, the culture of a town, the culture of a so-and-so, right? And I think these are just different languages that we use to describe what's happening in a synagogue at Capernaum. Does that make sense? And those things possess us just as drastically, I think, as this person is possessed in the synagogue at Capernaum. I mentioned this before, but it kind of bears repeating. I did a class last semester with a Lutheran pastor from Madagascar. The church of Madagascar is huge. I think there are like 1 or 2 million Lutherans in Madagascar. Remember, there are like 1.5 Episcopalians in the United States. There are a lot of Lutherans in Madagascar. But this guy was amazing. So he was doing this class in English. He also speaks French and Malagasy. Pretty remarkable. But all that to say, in the Lutheran Church of Madagascar, they have like an ordained official office of exorcist. In their church, it would be like having a Christian formation director. I'm touring a new family down the hall. I'm like, okay, here's Garrett, director of operations. Here's Laura, parish administrator. Emily, Christian formation. Here's Susie, exorcist. Maybe that's what Bob's office. We should put an exorcist. Wait, Bob, until you come back, your office is going to be the office of an exorcist. But in a way, maybe all of our offices are the office of exorcists, right? Isn't that kind of what we're in the business of, exorcising these tormenting demons, these tormenting spirits? And isn't that we're doing for each other, right? In this study, in this kind of very moment, all that to say. I found that to be fascinating. That for them, because they have one foot in a very enchanted kind of pre-modern world, and then one foot in the modern. They have to be 3 feet. 1 foot in the modern, and then 1 foot in the postmodern. Postmodern world. Yeah.
You ever known anybody who's done exorcism?
Okay, we do not call it that.
Okay, I know Karen would remember Shannon Johnson. He did he's a bishop, I think, in Virginia now.
There's a line in the Book of Occasional Services that said, in case of demon possession, call a bishop.
I actually experienced an exorcism at the Episcopal Church in Dallas.
Nice.
I was working as a volunteer, and all of a sudden, 2 broke preachers came in with holy water and went through the church. And we were all kind of in shock.
Our parish had 3 priests in a row that had affairs. And so the next
And so I've seen kind of things similar to that in the kind of charismatic movement within the Episcopal Church, and that kind of. Also, the best question like did it work? I guess that's it. Okay.
It did, but in a different way.
Yeah.
I just want to remind you that Ted Lasso did an exorcism.
Yes! Are y'all watching Ted Lasso? Please! Ted Lasso is the new Friday Night Lights. Like, this thing is indexed to the gospel. And so what happened in Ted Lasso, it was so good. It's about a soccer team, you know, for the through line through this Bible study. And what the idea on the episode of the show was the clubhouse or the field house had been like a field hospital during World War I, or a recruiting ground, and a lot of soldiers, whatever, World War I, getting got, bad Jews. And the team had never won much anything since then. So they thought they're going to exercise that. But this is cool. This is exactly what we're talking about. Each player brings like something that's kind of important to them that is kind of holding them back, and they burned it in a thing, and I don't know, there's some sporting stuff. But like that's pretty much like a youth ministry event. I mean, that's like the disappearing water. You know, you're writing the message and it disappears, and the thing. But I think we're very naive as modern people because we sort of turn down our nose at those kind of things. But actually, I think that it makes a great deal of sense to do things like that. Now we would sort of say, well, you're visualizing it so you can create it. It's more of a vision board type thing. But I don't know. I think there's more to it. Yeah, more to it.
In almost all Native American cultures, they will use sage or sweetgrass, particularly sage, and they will make a smudge of it and cleanse a place. Or in many Native American cultures, coming back from war, you have a cleansing ceremony to get rid of all that bad. And again, you use sage to cleanse. And as it turns out, scientifically, the use of sage is kind of an airborne, I don't know if it's an antibiotic, but it does help to cleanse disease from an area. That's cool. You have to use it for spiritual. Yes.
So,
Yeah,
I saw the movie, you know, so listen, what I want to know is, it has nothing to do with exorcism. Who's at the temple? I mean, this is like, we go to church on Sunday. Were they like there all the time? Was it just people coming in and out? Was it like, what many people do there?
Great question. Okay, it's a very surprising thing. We actually know very little about the life of the synagogue pre-70 AD destruction of the temple, which is what was happening. Most of what we know about the life of the synagogue comes from the New Testament, which is like pretty surprising, right? In fact, most of what we know about the Pharisees before the Jewish war comes from the New Testament. So it's a bit of a riddle to us. But the guess is, well, we do know some things. We know, of course, the Jewish Sabbath is sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, right? And there was a lot of variation, still is, in how the Sabbath is observed within the synagogue life of the congregation. And it would have looked a lot less like how we got it for worship. We are Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, French, Western Europe types, right? And when you're like that, you're like, well, it's at a time that starts and stops. You know what I mean? It's at an appointed time, an appointed end. But like the Orthodox Church doesn't really do it that way. It's kind of an in and out situation. And the synagogue, even today, has a bit of an in and out quality during the week and the Sabbath. So one imagines there's a lot less to do in the ancient world. Number one, that there were big moments, particularly the Sabbath observed was probably the biggest moment of the life of the synagogue, but there probably was study, worship, gathering happening throughout the week and throughout the Sabbath. Right? So when Jesus comes to read the scroll, he would have been invited to be there. He's somehow known as sort of an interesting rabbi to talk to. But we don't know that it's the whole community they're gathered yet. Right? It may just be a smattering of people, right? It may have been a group that looked a little bit like come the makeup of this group, right? A subset of Holy Trinity, or a subset of the community come together. I hope that gives you a sense.
Very much.
But it would have looked a little bit like an Episcopal service all the way up to communion, with readings, singing, a teaching, but then there would have been a longer series of kind of personal prayer that went before it and afterwards, right? So when it concluded, people wouldn't necessarily peace out. You know, I said it before, I'm a broken record, but Shreugene is this show that's on Amazon. It's like Friends, but for Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem in the 1990s. And there's a fair amount of synagogue stuff going on there. And even those modern Orthodox folks in the 90s in Jerusalem, when they show up to pray, there's already prayer going on, even when it's kind of a big moment. So it's more of a flow. Okay.
No.
Okay, yeah.
I was interested in verse 22. The people were amazed because they saw Jesus as one who had authority, and I'm surprised by that. I mean, what were they responding to? Because most people, when Jesus was speaking, thought he was nuts at that time. So, what is the basis of authority that comes across to people so that they say he has authority? He doesn't look, he doesn't have any backbone anyway. I'm just interested, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's great. So let's work our way through some of the sheet that's going to answer that exact question. That's a really good segue. Okay, so let's skip down to answer that question to the middle of the page. Thimothete, which Marcus bravely translates as "shut up." Right? If you open up your NRSV or RSV, you're not going to find that translation. It's going to be like he rebuked them, which is good, but it sounds a little Downton Abbey. Yeah, hold your peace. Yeah, it sounds a little, but Marcus argues that it's kind of slangy and it's a little bit rude if it were to come from a human being and a mere human being. But he points out that it doesn't appear much in literary Greek, which is very interesting. If you think about this is a new genre, and it's not done in the style of literary Greek. It's done in the kind of trade manual vocabulary, right? So this is populist literature. Which is, to me, is interesting. And then, so we were told that the demon is convulsing, or sparaxon, and that's an interesting word too. And it means to tear or to rend, especially to describe the actions of dogs and wild animals. That would be a main use of that verb. So it's not like this demon is just bothering this guy. Like, it is really actively harming him. It's actively harming him.
It's hard to imagine.
Yes.
Did it just happen back then?
Well, here's what I would equate it to. I have been in pastoral care interactions with people where you uncover anger and people start to breathe heavily, right? Their voice gets raised, right? They might even storm out. That's happened to me. It's happened to me before. So we, in our terminology, would say that their anger has taken hold of them and moved their body. And whenever that happens, it's very clear that that anger is actively hurting their life, right? Their anger is actively tearing apart their soul. And to me, that's my way of describing, my modern, disenchanted way of describing the same or similar phenomenon. Yeah, good, great question.
Jeff,
Yeah.
wouldn't these wild beasts, so to speak, recognize Jesus and Jesus, the demonic forces, because he did spend 40 days in the wilderness with them.
Yeah.
So they might have gotten to know each other a little bit, recognize one another. That was my clue back in verse 13 that something's going to be coming up related to the demons.
Karen, thank you for that timeline. Help the timeline. So remember, Jesus, like, the battle has begun, right? Human beings don't really realize there's a battle on.
Yeah.
But so like the demons have already been put on notice in the wilderness that there's an advance happening. There's an army moving and taking. Yeah. So yeah, we are kind of auditing a battle already begun. I think it's a great, I
So
think it's a great
the
step.
TikTok of the time.
It is, yeah, no, it is. But yeah, and to me, I'm always going back to Lord of the Rings. Remember the drama Lord of the Rings starts with the hobbits would rather just kind of stay in the Shire, right? And they say, like, well, it wasn't so bad. We just had a great party. We're gonna eat again in 2 hours, and it's nice. But what Gandalf comes and says is like, no. Like, the forces of Sauron are coming toward you, right? Maybe they're not here now, but there is a great conflict, and you can't just avoid it. And I think Tolkien's is basing some of that on this. Okay, so something I want to point out as we move to this question of authority. All the Gospels begin Jesus' public ministry in different ways, right? So all 4 Gospels have different ways of kicking off Jesus' public ministry after the temptation in the wilderness. Mark begins with an exorcism. That's important, right? In Mark, Jesus is coming to clear the earth of demons. That's who Jesus is. He is an advancing power coming to clear the earth of demons. That's not exactly who Matthew depicts. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's a different window onto who Christ is. And none of y'all are troubled by this, but from time to time I would talk to somebody who is troubled by the different depictions of Jesus in the 4 Gospels. And I always say the classic thing about how, right, if you get 4 eyewitnesses to tell the exact same story, then they're all lying. Right? Like recollection, human history, remembrance, none of it works. None of it works that way. And we end up in our personal relationships, right? Like when you tell the story of somebody's life, depending on how you know them and what you shared together, the experience, all of us, we want to think of ourselves as one unitary thing, but we're actually like multiple planes of a thing, kind of happening all at the same time. I remember when my grandfather died. My dad's a 5 on the Enneagram, and I would say this if he was sitting right here. And 5s on the Enneagram are famous for having like lots of group friends that they never discuss with the other friends, and don't even know about each other. And I remember when my granddad died, my dad's dad died. There were people who showed up to my granddad's burial who were like great buddies with my dad that I'd never heard of before. Like legitimately never heard of. Now that's pretty dramatic in the case of a 5, but I think it's to some degree it's true for all of us. Okay, so the thing about Matthew starts off with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? Because Matthew wants to focus on Jesus as what? The new Moses. Right? Jesus is the new Moses. Where does Luke start? Synagogue in Nazareth, preaching and almost getting killed. Remember Luke and Paul are really close to one another? Who is Jesus? The proclaimer of the good news, right? Which is very similar to Paul's understanding. The bringer of the gospel, right? The bringer of God's kingdom, right? Now John's a whole different kettle of fish. I mean, he starts off from Jump Street saying the beginning was the Word and the Word was made. I mean, like that's a whole different schema, which I'd love to talk about, but we don't have time. All right, so let's go to authority. Exousia. Every now and then Greek words are really fun to say. This is one of them. Exousia. What is Jesus' exousia? All right, the basic definition of that word at that time would be the ability to perform an action despite hindrances, right? Or the ability to do what they promise. And maybe we might translate it differently as like effectiveness. Enthusiasm. If you think about it, like, when Auburn goes to hire a football coach, right? What are they looking for? Someone with a proven track record of success, right? Has he been able to win where he was? Is he effective? Maybe that's a way of putting it. And so what they're seeing is that Jesus is able, by word and action, to start making the kingdom, making the kingdom known. To that point, there were all kind of people in Jesus' day that would have purported to have cast out demons and been kind of miracle workers. There's something about the way that Jesus commands demons without a lot of the hoodoo and things that seems kind of unique to him, right? But the power of his voice seems stentorian. It seems something remarkable of it. And it's really interesting. The critiques that we meet of Jesus are not he's making up his casting out demons. He's a faker. That critique doesn't happen. What they're going to say later is he's doing it in the name of Satan. He's one of Satan's minions. This is a satanic civil war that's happening. He is not the one who says he is the Lord of all. the Lord of all creation. So there's something in what he's doing that is unique. To get that, we've got to understand a few more things. This question of authority is related to what they say. Okay, so this question of authority is related to what is said in verse 22. That he teaches as one who has authority, not in the way that the scribes did. So we got to understand the scribes if we're going to understand verse 22 at all. Who the heck are these scribes? And like everything else, it's more complicated than that. Let's take a few steps back. To understand who the scribes are, we got to revisit who the Pharisees were, because they're related groups. We got to know who the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were the people, increasingly the dominant sect within Judaism, who focused on the observance of the law, right, as the organizing principle of Judaism. The Sadducees were the more conservative group, and they focused on the temple as the organizing principle of Judaism. But the Pharisees focused on the law as the organizing principle of Judaism. It's important to remember that the Pharisees have gotten a very unfair, bad rap in Christian preaching. Christian preachers have taken Jesus' critiques of the Pharisees and felt themselves deputized to dunk on the Pharisees, forgetting maybe that we shouldn't speak exactly as the Lord speaks, as if we were the Lord. Right? There are all manner of things that Jesus says in the New Testament that none of us should ever say, right? That shouldn't come from our lips, because He's the Lord and we're not. And dunking on the Pharisees is a really negative vein of Christian preaching, and I've done it, so I know all about it. Pharisees comes from the Hebrew word paros, which means separated ones. And this, we think, was probably a pejorative. You know, most groups get their names originally because somebody is dunking on them. But then they're like, you know what? We are that. We own it. So how most names get applied, right? Like, remember, like originally, like Obamacare was a criticism of the Affordable Health Care Act, but then President Obama was like, you know what? It is Obamacare. I'm running with it. Same thing with the Pharisees, right? The separated ones. Now, why were they separated? What they were saying is, Judaism of our time is corrupt. The temple is corrupt. Our leaders are corrupt. Herod is so corrupt we don't even have to call them corrupt. That would be redundant. We could just say he's Herod. Venal and self-interested and like not even ashamed of his corruption. Herod is one of these types. So how do we work against that? The Zealots wanted to raise up an army and overthrow Herod and the Romans and the rest of them. The Pharisees had a different answer. They said, we're going to observe the law. We're going to renew Judaism from within Judaism. So we're going to gather into communities that observe the law together, and that separated them from the larger community. Right? Does that make sense? It's easy to criticize, but there's a logical sense to it. And it's a whole lot better than killing your neighbors, right, who are in debt with their Herodian. It's a lot better to actually form an alternative society within that society. It's very important to remember, too, that the Pharisees are the only sect to survive the Jewish war. So when the temple is destroyed in 70 and the Jews are conquered, the Sadducees are effectively wiped off the map. The Zealots are all killed, or they forget they were Zealots. You know, they just sort of shrink into the rest of the population, and now they're Pharisees. And so they're the only ones left. And the Pharisees become Judaism as we know it. The Pharisees become rabbinic Judaism. The Judaism that we know comes from the Pharisees, and it results from the Jewish war.
So Jennifer, my name was Paul, a Pharisee.
Paul was a Pharisee. Great question. And as you think about Paul, it's a good window into the Pharisees, right? As someone steeped in the law of God. You know, when we read Paul, it's so hard to understand because there's like a reference to the Hebrew Scriptures in every other line. Because that was his training. That's what he was steeped in. Great question. All right, so a lot of the life of the Pharisees was organized around voluntary eating societies. Right? So communal tables, communal meals together. And remember, Jesus is going to be critical of that, right? Because the Pharisees gather with themselves and exclude the poor, the downtrodden, and the lost, which is a fair criticism. But it's important to remember that that's a criticism from within the movement, right? So if we're going to put Jesus in any camp, he would have been closest to the Pharisees. He's not saying that gathering around the table and following the law is a bad in itself. He's just saying we've got to continue, we never stop expanding the scope of who's a part of this, right? So it's very easy for us to dump on the Pharisees and say they're persnickety, puritanical, rule-following elitists. But that's not really what Jesus is. That's not really what he's criticizing. And this is very cool. Phariseeism is a populist movement. So think about the life of the temple. It was controlled by literally a caste system. You had to be a Levite or a descendant of Aaron to be a member of the priestly caste, and they controlled the economy of the temple. Right? It was very much like the caste system in India, right? Like where there's a priestly class in and of itself. There was a priestly caste system in ancient Judaism. And the Pharisees are a populist movement pushing against that. So we would like that. As modern people, we're into that kind of popularizing, broader power base, kind of human rightsy type vibe that the Pharisees are up to. And the Pharisees did this amazing thing. The Pharisees changed Judaism, and under their watch, the table became an altar, the home a temple, and the private person a priest. It's pretty cool, right? Part of what we're doing here today is appreciating Phariseeism. When people ask you, what you did your Bible study? We rehab the reputation of the Pharisees. And we're better Christians for it, okay? But if you think about that, all the various little laws that we see the Pharisees fall into, washing, and the giving, and the organizing of your life, and the clothing, and all that stuff. In the Old Testament, it says that that's just for the priests, or most of that stuff is just for the priests. But the Pharisees read in the Old Testament an expansion of that, saying, oh, weren't we told we're a kingdom of priests? Maybe what Moses meant was not just one or two families, or one or two tribes. Maybe these are laws for all of us. So no matter if you're from the tribe of Benjamin, or Naphtali, or Issachar, which are no longer even relevant anymore, or not on the map, they don't have a claim to the temple, we're going to live like priests. Can you see it's kind of a beautiful, it's kind of a beautiful movement? Okay, related to that are the scribes. I share this great quote. I love it when we get a nod. And Joel Marcus referenced the Episcopal Church, so I had to share it with you. On page 522 and 23, a lot of work for that payoff. Okay? It's a lot of digging to get yourself to this reference for the Episcopal Church. Quote, within the constraints imposed by the Bible, which does, after all, treat priests and the laity as distinct groups, the Pharisees nevertheless seem to have moved in the direction of an admittedly paradoxical notion of lay priesthood. A certain parallel may be found in the internal tension within Episcopalianism, which isn't just one of the internal tensions, with one of the internal tensions within Episcopalianism, which on the one hand embraces the idea of the priesthood of all believers, yet on the other hand maintains a distinct office for priests. Pretty interesting, right? All right, let's start with the scribes for a minute. The scribes were related to but different from the Pharisees. The scribes were likely members of the priestly caste, right? So they were descendants of Aaron or descendants of Levi. But they were not the most well-to-do of the priestly class, right? There are only one or two families actually swapped the high priesthood. Because remember those confusing bits in the Gospels when they said, like, Annas, the father of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. You get the sense that they just swapped it back and forth, because they did. In fact, most of them were Greek-speaking and didn't know much of Judaism anyway at this point. But they were less affluent, less connected members of these priestly tribes who lived all in the various regions of Israel. And their job was not to monitor the life of the temple, but to make judicial rulings on the law, which you needed a priest for. Right? So if you have a dispute with your neighbor involving the law of Moses, you got to find a scribe to have them rule on it, so you can move on. Right? If you had a boil or something and the boil went away, and now you want to be readmitted back to society, you got to go find a priest or a scribe. And if you lived all the way up in the Galilee, you weren't going to go to the temple. You needed to find a scribe. It was Galilee based, so you could go do your work. And this is there's a great This American Life a few years ago. But it was about the difficulty that Orthodox women, and the story was based in like New York, but I guess it could be other locations. But the difficulty that Orthodox women had in obtaining a divorce. You have to get a legal document called a get. If an Orthodox woman is in a really abusive situation, they really have to find that get in order to get out of that situation. And it's all about finding a rabbi who has a kind of more permissive view or more open view of that. And then they're kind of known, right? So you kind of somehow get connected to a rabbi that will get you a get, and so on, so on, so on, and so forth. But it's the same kind of idea, right? Like we need a ruling on the law to go for the right. That's what the scribes were. So, yeah.
Well, the scribe, what that word scribe has always meant to me, somebody who writes for you.
And Bill, it can very easily do that too, right? So like let's say a case of divorce, case of property dispute, all the various things the law of Moses, you probably needed from a scribe some kind of written down thing. Your judicial ruling that then you could then produce to create whatever action you wanted to create in the world. So that may be the derivation of how they get that.
And like a death, it's got to be something written.
It's all it's written, exactly. And so the scribes could have also been Pharisees, right? They had been members of the priestly class. Remember, you don't have to be in the right tribe to be a Pharisee. Anybody can be a Pharisee. In fact, Josephus was a great historian of the ancient world where we learn a lot of this stuff. He was a member of the priestly caste, but also it says he's a Pharisee. Because Phariseeism is winning the day. Phariseeism is out narrating all the other versions of Judaism at this point. So even priestly people are becoming Pharisees, but you didn't have to be a Pharisee to be a scribe. Does that make sense? I know this is very tedious, but it actually helps when you get into church and you hear these things. It actually kind of helps inform our worldview. Now, but here's the deal: most of the scribes were reported, and this is just like from ancient stuff, to give sort of wooden commercial transaction type rulings on the law. Right? You go to them. It's not like a sermon. It's not interesting. You know, it's like it's like you're paying for a service, almost like a spiritual notary republic, or a republic, to a certain extent. And they were always simply basing their ruling on something that was written down in the law of Moses. So when Jesus stands up to preach from the scriptures, he is offering a new interpretation, which the scribes would never do. And what they're saying is, holy smokes, he sounds like Isaiah. He sounds like Jeremiah. Doesn't sound like anything like the scribes. I mean, they're like, there's a different thing happening here with this holding up of the scriptures. And we haven't had a prophet like this in hundreds of years. Does that make sense on kind of what it's authority to offer a new teaching, but it's charisma, but it's also based on the scriptures. And to them, it sounds like a new thing that they've only heard and read about. It's new because they've never experienced it themselves. There's nobody walking around who heard Jeremiah preach. There's nobody walking around who heard Isaiah preach, or even heard the minor prophets, Nahum and Malachi, and Amos. Nobody around anymore who remembers them. And so it feels like the new entry of something very old. Not unlike when the lost king of Gondor shows up, right? We thought the line had run out, right? It does not stop with the Tolkien. It does not stop with the Tolkien references. I hope some of that makes sense. All right, questions about that? Thoughts about that?
I just wanted to say I had I don't know if you ever had that experience, but I had an experience where they said, can they have a laying on of hands for healing? And I said, certainly. So I played, and people just spontaneously put their hands on me. And you could feel the healing spread, just flow out. I mean, they really, there's an experience to see, just feel that flow. And everybody will talk about it afterwards.
Amen. Amen. Karen, you got something?
I sit here and sort of stew over things so that it'll always make sense even to me. But I was thinking about, Bill, what you said, because I had that little asterisk about when I was reading, and the authority that Jesus was showing. And it seems like to me, you don't talk about it in Mark, but in the other Gospels, you get that backstory when Jesus was a child in the temple and that kind of thing. So, of course, we, the Jewish tradition, you have your bar mitzvah, that kind of thing. So would Jesus' authority really have started to be seen maybe then? would they have known that?
Great
I'm trying
question.
to make sense for
No,
myself.
great question.
Sorry.
But there had to be some knowledge of Jesus that would cause him to be invited to preach at the synagogue and convert him to the kingdom. So this is the beginning of folk ministry, but there has to be some kind of antecedent to this that we don't know, that possibly everybody involved knew, so they kind of, it's prologue. But yeah.
I guess I've just been thinking about this wrong, but I thought that when it said they were amazed that he taught as one who had authority, I thought that they were skeptical at that point, because why would he be saying this, and what authority does he have? But then, after the casting out demons, then he continued to teach you, they knew that he actually had the authority. That was where I was still at.
Well, I think it's a both situation, Dan. I think they are seeing his authority, and yet it's confusing them at the same time. I think they're befuddled, which is good for us, because that is the experience when God moves in your life. What issues is befuddlement and confusion and alarm and all the various things. So I think it's both.
What I'm thinking about with this authority is, about scribes and stuff, it's like the scribes are here and they know the law and the law is there and they can say it and can use it. But it's like Jesus embodies all of that and they see it. Occasionally you will be around someone who has that. When you meet them, there is something else to them.
He is the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And
So where he is, the demons cannot be, because he is, I think it's beautifully said. And seriously, that connects, y'all all heard this scripture at burials before. Remember when Lazarus dies, this is all in John. Lazarus dies. And Jesus comes, and the burial liturgy, which went on for days in that time, is ongoing. Remember, Martha runs out to meet Jesus before he comes into the larger group, and she says to him, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. What were you doing?
Mm-hmm.
What would you possibly have been doing if you weren't here? If you weren't here, and then he said back to her, basically a statement of resurrection. And she's like, yeah, I get it. We're all resurrected, but he's dead right now. I mean, that's more or less what she's saying, right? He's holding comfort to it. And that's when he says the beautiful statement, I am the resurrection, and I am the life. Right? We too often we know that verse out of context, but it's in the context of a conversation where he's saying, resurrection is already here. Your brother is dead, and he's not dead. Right now, in this moment. Right? And I think that's what you're pointing to, which is such a beautiful reality. Where he is, the kingdom is, and the demons are going to fly from him. All right, let me wrap up, and then we'll have a chance maybe to do a couple of things. And Joel Marcus pointed something that I've never noticed before, which I think is really powerful. When Jesus says, and immediately there was a man in an unclean spirit. Now Marcus is being literal here, right? Some other translations clean this up to make a little more sense. But a man in an unclean spirit. And what Marcus is arguing is that the man's personality has been usurped by the demon. And it has swallowed him up. This is a picture of a man in an unclean spirit. So he is enclosed by that which contaminates him. And that's a horrifying image. And it's a true image. And I don't know why I thought this, but I thought immediately, y'all remember a few months ago there was a deranged young man who shot up an Asian, toenail massage, kind of foot massage place, or whatever they call those places. And he said that he developed this anti-Asian animus from watching a great deal of pornography, right? And the intaking of those images, which I imagine were terrible, warped him and took possession of him, right? This happens right now to people in our community, and not just pornography, other things, but that's one of the demonic ways that this is happening. And it's a big reason why we need to be the church, inviting people to church, inviting people to fellowship, inviting people to Bible study. There are demon-possessed people all over our community who we need to say, come here. My demons are being cast out. Yours could be cast out too. Christianity is not just a nice thing we do. It is life and death. To me, it really is life and death. for people all of our community who are isolated, lonely, and therefore are being racked by demons. There's a way of reading like the Capitol riot on January the 6th as a whole group of people possessed by demons, right? Isolated and possessed by demons who need the power of the gospel to cast out, who are even some of them using Christian language in a demonic way, which we know, that shouldn't surprise us, right? Because remember, Satan quoted scripture to Jesus, right? So, all I say, to me, this is very real. It's very life and death, and it gives a real impetus for what we do and why and why we do it. Okay. And also, I thought this was kind of cool too. Like, what is it? His authority? Well, basically, it's like Jesus shows up with a new teaching. He starts barking orders, and people respond to him. You're right. It's a little bit like General Patton. Right? Like, I know y'all had this experience too. Like, it's not just a military thing, but I remember. So we got to coach soccer again. I know it's a whole thing today. But we at some point when you're playing footy, you graduate from like parents or your parents' friends coaching to like real soccer coaches. And we went from a guy when we were like U12, U13, who knew footy. He played footy in college, but he was like a friend of our parents. They kind of knew each other. But then later on, we became a different club, got in a bigger team, and literally we were coaching a guy who played for the Ethiopian national team. Right? Like played in Europe, Ethiopian, grew up in Africa, very different existence than we had. And he was the kind of guy, it's like, you just found yourself following orders immediately, right? Like without questions asked. Like the tenor of his voice, his character, the tone of his thing. It's like, okay, sure, yes, all right, what's the plan? I don't think right back, now I do. I'm right back. That's great. Yeah. But I think it's a little bit maybe just to choose a concrete metaphor of how it maybe felt to be in Jesus' presence. You found yourself kind of called up into something. And it's not that different than some of y'all are great galvanizers, right? You're great organizers of ministry. And you know you were in the grips of a great galvanizer when you found you agreed to something you didn't know you agreed to? Right? When you've been caught up in the sweep of something, you've been caught in the train of something. That's charisma, right? Charisma has a gravitational pull. And you think of Jesus as the greatest, most charismatic figure to ever walk the earth. He's pulling up everything into his way, right? Pulling up everything into the gravity of his charisma. All right, let me just read the last things and then we'll get out of here. Okay? And leaving the synagogue, they immediately went into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying down because she had a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And coming forward, he grasped her by the hand and raised her up. And the fever left her, and she began serving them. When evening had come, after the sun had gone down, the people began bringing to him all those who were sick and afflicted by demons, and the whole city was gathered at the door. Now remember that they couldn't come during the Sabbath to Peter's house. They could go to the synagogue, but you can't go to Peter's house and carry your loved ones, right? So they've heard about this preacher at the synagogue, and they're just waiting for it to be sundown. And they're going to show up in mass to get their people healed. And he healed many people who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons, and he did not let the demons speak because they knew him. Messianic secret. All right, we're going to talk about the Messianic secret. Not next week, because we're off next week. I'm out of town. Apologies. We will not meet next week, but then we'll resume a week after next week, right? So a week from next week. I'll send an email to remind everybody. Y'all the best. Send me questions as they come up. Thank you for a great discussion.
Yeah.